Chapter 6, Parts 2, 3, and 4 of A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Graham Redman. A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1, by John Bagnell Bury, Chapter 6, Part 2, The Persian Conquest of Asiatic Greece. The kingdom of Lydia had performed a certain function in the development of Greece. Besides the invention of coinage, which was its one great contribution to the civilization of mankind, besides the influence which its luxury and tyranny exercised on Ionia, the mere existence of the Lydian realm in its intermediate position between Greece and the East was of considerable importance as a bulwark against the great Oriental empires. It kept Greece from coming into direct contact with the empire of Assyria. It kept Greece for 60 years from coming into direct contact with the empire of Media. When the barrier is swept away, a new period is opened in Grecian history. The Greeks now stand face to face with the power of a monarch whose dominion stretches far away beyond the Euphrates, beyond the Tigris, into lands which are totally unknown to them. The Asiatic Greeks are now to exchange subjection to a lord of Sardis for subjection to a potentate who holds his court in a city so distant that the length of the journey is told by months. The distance of the centre from the extremities of the empire was of the utmost significance. The king was obliged to leave his conquests in Asia Minor to the government of his satraps, and the Greeks were unable to exercise any influence upon him, as they might have done if he had ruled from Sardis or some nearer capital. This was all the more unfortunate on account of another difference which distinguished the Persian from the Lydian kingdom. While the Lydians were outside the Aryan family, the Persians and Medes spoke a language of the same stock as that of the Greeks. It may be thought that if the Persians had come under Greek influence, Iranian history would have taken a different course. For the Persians were a people marked out to fall under the influence of others, and not to hew an independent path for themselves. In their own highlands, like the Spartans in the Laconian Vale, they might live unspotted from the world, a valiant, simple, and truthful race, but when they once went forth to conquer and to rule, it was their inevitable doom to be led captive by their captives, and to adopt the manners and ideals of more intellectual and original peoples. If Cyrus had transported the centre of his empire to the west, the Greeks might have been the teachers of their Persian speech-fellows. But such an idea would have occurred to no Mede or Persian. Consequently, the new Iranian kingdom fell under the relaxing influences of the corrupt Semitic civilizations of Babylonia and Assyria, and it had soon become a despotism so typically Oriental that it is hard to remember that the ruling peoples spoke a tongue akin to the Greek. Hence the struggle of 200 years, upon which we are now entering, between Greece and Persia, though strictly and literally it was a struggle between Aryan peoples, that is, of Aryan speech, assumes the larger character of strife between Europe and Asia, between East and West, between Aryan and non-Aryan, and takes its place as the first encounter in that still unclosed debate which has arrayed Europe successively against Babylonian, Phoenician, Saracen, and Turk. At the beginning of the campaign against Lydia, Cyrus had invited the Ionians who were in the army of Croesus to change sides. They had refused to Medize, not perhaps from loyalty to the rule of the Lydian, under which they chafed, but because they did not anticipate his utter overthrow, and therefore feared his vengeance. This refusal annoyed Cyrus, and when after the fall of Sardis the Greek cities made overtures to the conqueror, he declined to make any conditions. Only with Miletus, which had not been subject to Lydia and had stood aloof from the contest, did he conclude a sort of treaty like that in which Croesus had recognized her independence. The others prepared to defend themselves. Cyrus himself had greater projects which recalled him to the Far East, and he committed the lesser task of reducing the Asiatic Greeks to the lieutenants whom he left in Lydia. The want of unity among the Ionians was disastrous. They might meet in their Panionic assembly, but they seem to have been without the ability or the organization to carry out any plan of common action. The most powerful of all the states, Miletus, had gone her own path and stood quite apart. One of her citizens, Thales, the astronomer and philosopher, whom we have met before, is said to have ventured himself into the speculations of political as well as of celestial science. He saw the weakness of Ionia in its disunion, and the futility of the loose league of the Panionian, and he made the remarkable proposal that Ionia should form itself into an united nation, with one hall of council as well as one place of assembly, each city surrendering her sovereignty and becoming merely a town or deme of the state, and he suggested Chios as the fitting place for the capital. The idea, whether it was put forward by Thales or not, was assuredly suggested by the political development of Attica, the mother country of the Ionians. It was an idea which the proposer can hardly have hoped to persuade the Ionians to adopt, but it had its value as a comment on the disunion of the Greeks in the one part of Greece where, above all others, there was needed a closer unity and a solid, serried front to resist the aggression of the great barbarian powers. Another proposal, which was made in one of the ineffectual meetings of the Panionian, receives the approval of the historian Herodotus. Bias, a statesman of Priene, advised all the Ionians to sail forth together to the west, to the great island of Sardinia, and there found an Ionian city-state, and live happy and free. This proposal illustrates the terror and despair of Ionia at the prospect of Persian rule. Disunited, the Asiatic Greeks were an easy prey. Harpagus, the general of Cyrus, reduced them one after another. Tribute was imposed upon them, and the burden of serving in the Persian armies, when such service was required, but no restrictions were placed upon the freedom of their commerce. To the inhabitants of two cities, exile seemed more endurable than this new slavery, and they acted in the spirit of Bias. The people of Phocea, or the more part of them, embarked in their penteconters and sailed to the island of Corsica, where their own settlement of Eulalia received them. The Chians did likewise, but found a nearer home on the coast of Thrace, where they founded Abdera. One common effort, indeed, the Aeolians and Ionians made for their defence. They made a common appeal to the most powerful state in the mother country. They sent an embassy to Lacedaemon, but the Spartans, whose horizon was bounded by the Peloponnesus, did as little for them as they had done for Croesus. Sparta had the curiosity, however, to send a ship to Ionia to spy out the condition of the country and the power of Cyrus. The story is that one of her reconnoitrers went up to Sardis, and standing before the Persian king forbade him to work harm to any Greek community, since the Lacedaemonians will not permit it. The anecdote was doubtless invented by those who liked a jest at the expense of Sparta, but if Cyrus might well ask, "Who are the Lacedaemonians?" his successors learned the answer to their cost. The conqueror of Lydia returned to the east to subdue the mightier power of Babylon. The conquest occupied some years, then the greatest city on earth was taken, and Cyrus took to himself the title of King of Babel, Sumer, and Akkad, and of the 4 quarters of the world, thus formally entering into the Babylonian inheritance. The dominion of Cyrus the Great extended in the east over Armenia and Hyrcania, Parthia and Bactria, and into the midst of Afghanistan, from the coasts of the Aegean to the banks of the Jaxartes. But his conquests lie outside our history. His last enterprise was the subjugation of the Massagetae, a Scythian folk near the Aral Lake, and one story says that he was slain in battle against them, and that the savage queen placed his head in a basin of blood. All we know with certainty is that his body was buried in Persia, and 200 years hence we shall visit his tomb at Pasargadae in the company of a conqueror who was mightier even than he. End of chapter 6, part 2. Chapter 6, part 3. Persian conquest of Egypt. Polycrates of Samos. The subjugation of Lydia and the Greek seaboard carried the borders of the Iranian Empire under its new dynasty farther westward than the Assyrian conquest had ever reached. 2 lords of Sardis had indeed acknowledged the overlordship of the kings of Nineveh, but that relation had been of brief duration and slight significance, and Lydia can hardly be said to have ever formed a part of the Assyrian dominion. In subduing the Greeks of the coast, at all events, Cyrus broke entirely new ground. They had never paid submission in any shape to Assyria. But while he far outpassed the utmost limits of Assyria in some directions, he left unconquered the great kingdom of the south, which had once been part of the Assyrian Empire. But his son Cambyses repaired the omission. It was inevitable that the new lords of Syria should seek to bring Egypt under their subjection. We saw how Egypt, like Media itself and Babylonia, threw off the Assyrian yoke and entered upon a new period of national prosperity under enlightened rulers. King Amasis, who climbed the throne by a revolution, maintained his power by a bodyguard of Ionian and Carian mercenaries, like a Greek tyrant. An Egyptian writing tells us how he loved the strong wine of Celebai of Egypt. He built great temples to the Egyptian gods, like the pharaohs of old, but in his patronage of Greece he may be compared to Croesus. He sent gifts to the Greek sanctuaries, he subscribed generously to the rebuilding of the temple at Delphi. He married a Greek princess of Cyrene. Under him Naucratis rose to the rank of a city, though the only city where Greeks were allowed to trade. He had extended his sway over the island of Cyprus when the power of Babylonia was declining, but the Cypriots threw off his yoke when Cyrus entered into the Babylonian heritage and made their submission to the Persian. Amasis trembled at the rise of the new power in the east, and he lived to witness with dismay the preparations of Cambyses. But he died a few months before the invasion, and the blow fell upon his son Psammetichus. A fierce battle near Pelusium delivered Egypt into the hands of the Persians. The conqueror led his army up the Nile, and perhaps he extended the southern frontier of the Egyptian kingdom on the side of Nubia. The Egyptians said that he planned the conquest of all Ethiopia and was compelled to return through want of provisions, so that his enterprise came to nothing. But the Egyptians hated Cambyses, who openly scoffed at their religion, and it is possible that they may have represented as an inglorious failure what was really a successful effort to secure the southern frontier. The conquest of Egypt, which became a Persian satrapy, led to the submission of Greek Cyrene, even as the conquest of Lydia had led to the subjection of the Greeks of the neighbouring coasts. Amasis and his son might have hoped, when the Persian danger threatened, that they could depend on the support of a powerful Greek friend, the lord of Samos. In that island, not long after the Persian conquest of Ionia, a certain Polycrates and his two brothers had established a joint tyranny over the state with the help of Lygdamis of Naxos. But Polycrates removed his brothers by death and banishment, and became sole tyrant. He organized a fleet of 100 Penteconters, and made Samos a strong power. As the Ionian mainland had fallen under Persian dominion, he had perhaps the strongest Greek sea power in the Aegean. His luxurious court was brightened by the presence of the Bacchic poet Anacreon. He completed the building of the great temple of Hera, but the most famous of his works was the aqueduct which supplied the city with water from a spring beyond a hill. The engineering skill of the Megarian architect Eupalinus, who perhaps also constructed the waterworks of Pisistratus at Athens, carried the duct through the hill by a tunnel. In all that he put his hand to, Polycrates prospered. He defied the power of Persia, he extended his influence over some of the Ionian cities under Persian sway, he hoped perhaps to become the lord of all Ionia. It was natural that he and Amasis of Egypt should form a close alliance based on the common interest of antagonism to Persia. But when the hour of peril came, when Cambyses moved upon Egypt, the Samian tyrant altered his policy. He felt that his navy was unequal to coping with the joint armaments of Phoenicia and Cyprus, and instead of coming to the aid of his old friend's son, he sent 40 ships to increase the fleet of the invader. These ships, however, never reached Egypt. The tyrant had manned them with those Samians whom he most suspected of hating himself and his tyranny, but his trick recoiled. At the island of Carpathus the crew took the resolve of sailing back to Samos and overthrowing the despot. Defeated in a battle, they sought the aid of Sparta, and their appeal was strongly backed by the Corinthians, whose trade probably suffered from the pirate ships of Polycrates. The Lacedaemonians sent an armament to besiege Samos. It was their first expedition to the east, and it was a failure. Despairing of taking the city, and repulsed in a conflict, they returned home. We cannot charge Polycrates with perfidy in espousing the cause of Persia against Egypt, since we are ignorant of his relations not only with Psammetichus, but with Amasis in the last years of that monarch's reign. We might indeed gather from the story of the ring of Polycrates that the alliance had ceased to exist, and that it was Amasis who had broken it off. Amasis, hearing of his friend's marvellous prosperity, never varied by a reverse, wrote him a letter, expressing misgivings at a good fortune so great and enduring that it could not fail to draw down the envy of heaven, and counselling Polycrates to cast away whatever possession it would give him the most pain to lose. Cast it away utterly, out of the world. Polycrates, taking the words to heart, manned a Penteconter, and having rowed out to sea, cast into the waves the most precious thing he had, an emerald ring engraved by the gem-cutter Theodorus. A few days later a fisherman came to his house, and presented him with a huge fish. The ring was found inside it. Polycrates wrote to Amasis an account of what had happened, and Amasis, when he read the letter, discerned that it was impossible for any man to deliver another from that which was destined to befall him. Convinced, therefore, that Polycrates would come to no good end, and not wishing to have to grieve for a friend's misfortune, Amasis broke off the tie of guest friendship which bound them. The forecast of the Egyptian was fulfilled. Soon after his repulse of the Lacedaemonian attack, Polycrates fell into a trap laid for him by the Persian satrap of Sardis, and was seized and crucified. End of chapter 6, part 3. Chapter 6, part 4. Ionia under Darius. King Cambyses was recalled from Egypt by a rebellion. He had put to death, on suspicions of disloyalty, his brother Smerdis, to whom he had entrusted the regency of some of the eastern provinces, and a usurper had arisen, pretending to be the dead Smerdis, to whom he bore a remarkable likeness. Cambyses went in haste to crush the false Smerdis, but as he passed through Syria he found death by his own hand, as is related in a great writing on the rock of Behistun. The next heir to the Persian throne was a certain Hystaspes, who was satrap of Parthia, and had a son named Darius. But Hystaspes made no attempt to secure his right, and the false Smerdis established himself so firmly that, as Darius wrote afterwards in that famous inscription of the rock, no Persian nor Mede dared to oppose him. But Darius had different thoughts from his father, and conspiring with 6 nobles he killed the usurper and became king himself. In the first years of his reign his force and ability were proved in the task of quelling rebellions which broke out in almost all parts of the wide realm which Cyrus had put together. Elam, Babylonia, Media, Armenia revolted. A new false Smerdis arose. Babylon had to be twice besieged. Having established his power firmly and crushed all resistance, Darius recorded for future ages the hardly won successes of his first years in an inscription on the lofty rock of Behistun, on the upper course of the river Coaspes. The writing is in the Persian, the Susic, and the Babylonian languages. By wedding Atossa, the daughter of Cyrus and widow of her brother Cambyses, Darius linked himself closely to the family of his predecessors. He proceeded to reorganize the administration of his dominion. He extended the system of satrapies or governments, and the whole realm was divided into 20 such satrapies. West of the Halys, the old kingdom of Lydia consisted of 3 provinces, but subject to 2 satraps. The Ionian and the Lydian under one governor who resided at Sardis, the Phrygian, which included the Greek cities of the Propontis, under a governor whose seat was at Deucalion. These satraps did not interfere in the local affairs of the Greek cities, which were ruled by despots, and the despots might do much as they pleased, so long as they paid tribute duly and furnished military contingents when required. The despots liked the Persian rule, which secured their power, and this explains the noteworthy fact that the Greeks of Asia Minor made no attempt to shake off the Persian yoke during the troubles which ushered in the reign of Darius. It is possible, too, that their condition under the rule of Cambyses was better than under Darius, for Darius is said to have instituted a fixed yearly tribute instead of irregular contributions. Commerce, however, was furthered by this king's monetary reforms, and by his improvement of the road system in Persia. He adopted the bimetallic coinage which Croesus had introduced in Lydia. The chief piece of Persian gold money was always known in Greece by the name darik. The royal road, by which the messengers between Susa and Sardis came and went, was divided into stages marked off by regular stations. Its length was over 1,500 miles, and the way was counted a 3 months' journey for a man on foot. A Greek who had to visit Susa would land at Ephesus and in 3 days reach Sardis. The road ran through the heart of Phrygia, by the tomb of Midas the Golden King, past Pessinus and Ancyra, and across the Halys to Pteria, the ancient Cappadocian city which Croesus took, then across the Halys again, southward to Mazaka and Comana, to cross the Taurus and reach the Euphrates at Samosata. Beyond the Euphrates it skirted the mountains which bound Mesopotamia on the north, passing Nisibis and reaching the Tigris at Nineveh, the ruined capital of Assyria. Beyond Arbela it went southeastward to the river Coaspes and Susa. A good and safe road, carefully maintained, brought Central Asia nearer to the Aegean, and helped to open the east to Western curiosity. The construction of the royal road must have had an incalculable effect in widening Greek ideas of geography. Its influence is shown by the importance which it assumed on the first Greek maps. Conceived as a straight line running east and west, it plays, on one of the maps which were used by Herodotus, practically the same part which is played in the modern atlas by the equator. The longitudes were determined by the conception that the Nile and the Danube, the two greatest rivers known within the range of the Greek world, were in the same meridian, the Danube being supposed to flow from north to south. This meridian line passed through Sinope. It was a principle of the early Greek geographers, who arose about the end of the 6th century in Ionia, that the features of the earth were symmetrically arranged. The attempt to apply mathematical principles to a small portion of the earth very imperfectly observed necessarily produced maps which to our fuller knowledge appear grotesque. But it would be hard to overestimate the intellectual activity of the Ionian investigators who made the new departure, Anaximander and Hecataeus, both citizens of Miletus. Anaximander constructed the first map, and Hecataeus wrote a geography which served as a text to Anaximander's map. Hecataeus was himself a traveller. He composed the earliest guide-book to the wonders of Egypt, and he could supplement his own observations by second-hand material gathered, in the great centre of trade where his home was, from travellers and strangers. This development of geography in Ionia was certainly forwarded by the royal road, and so far the Persian conquest of eastern Greece was an advantage to European civilization. Europe owes so much to the Ionian intellects which at this period were breaking new paths of progress, that we may linger a moment longer over the movement of intellectual discovery before resuming the march of events. It was a movement of the most interesting kind, in which the instinct for speculation and the thirst for positive knowledge were closely united. For Anaximander, the first chartographer, map-making is only part of his wider work as a physical philosopher. Dissatisfied with the theory of Thales, who found the first principle of the universe in water, he sought it in a more general conception, which he designated, negatively, as the unlimited. Unlimited, that is, by qualities, and so capable of differentiation into all the kinds of definite matter which our senses perceive. Hecataeus is the founder of Greek history. He partly breaks with the old traditions and criticizes the Hesiodic school of theology. The heroes who appeared in legend as sons of the gods he regards as the bastard sons of women who, to shield their shame, ascribed the fatherhood to Zeus or Apollo. "The stories of the Greeks," he says, "are, in my opinion, manifold and absurd." Thus reason was asserting itself against authority in the religious sphere, and Hecataeus was one of the pioneers. But more effective than he in pressing the claims of reason was another Ionian, his contemporary Xenophanes of Colophon, and we shall have to consider the importance of his work in another connection. The remoteness of Susa from the Greek seas, and the homesickness of Greeks whom any chance transported to the far east, find an illustration in the curious story of the physician Democedes of Croton. This man's skill had earned high salaries as public physician at Aegina and Athens, and higher still in the service of Polycrates of Samos. He was carried off as a prisoner to Susa in consequence of a series of troubles which followed the death of that tyrant, and he was taken from his dungeon to try his craft for Darius, who had sprained a foot in the chase. His success gained him the king's favour, and there was nothing which he might not ask, except the one thing which he desired, permission to return to Greece. One day he was summoned by Queen Atossa, who was suffering from a tumour on the breast, and he made her swear that if he cured her, she would do what he asked. Acting by his directions, she stirred up the king to cherish the project of conquering the Greeks, and suggested that he should send spies under the conduct of Democedes to travel through Greece and bring back a report. These counsels of the daughter of Cyrus carried weight with Darius, according to the story, and the plan of Democedes succeeded. He promised to return to Susa, and Darius gave him rich presents for his kinsfolk. The Persians who accompanied him were privately charged to see that he did not escape. When they came to Taras, for the story assumes that Italiot Greece was included in the programme of the journey, the lord of that city arrested the Persians as spies, and kept them in prison until Democedes had time to escape to his native town. When the Persians were released, they followed him to Croton, but the Crotoniads refused to give him up. A Persian invasion of Italy was a contingency which they might reasonably risk. Such is the strange story, blended of fact and fiction, which men told of the first Greek physician who practised at the court of Susa. He was not the last. We shall meet hereafter a more famous leech, who did not yearn back to Greece, and wrote the history of his adopted country. End of Chapter 6, Part 4. Recording by Graham Redman.